All right, so let's get right into this deep dive. Today, we're going deep on back pain, something I know a lot of us strength training enthusiasts struggle with. And to guide us on this journey, we have Rebuilding Milo by Aaron Horschig and Dr. Kevin Santana. And I'm really excited to kind of dig into this and see what kind of insights we can uncover to, help us get back to lifting pain free.
Yeah, it's really interesting how this book, right off the bat, kind of challenges some of the common assumptions we have about back pain. You know, like the idea that an MRI is going to give us all the answers that we need.
Yeah, totally. I remember when I had a back flare up a while back, and the first thing my doctor wanted to do was send me for an MRI. And, I was so convinced it was going to show like some catastrophic damage. But you know what? It came back totally normal. And it was so frustrating because I was still in so much pain, but the scan showed nothing.
Right, and that's a perfect example of one of the things that Horschig and Santana talk about in the book. A lot of people can have disc bulges or other things that show up on imaging, but never actually feel any pain. It's kind of like having a dent in your car that doesn't actually affect how it drives. And they even mentioned this power lifter, Josiah O'Brien, who had a really serious spinal injury during a competition just out of the blue, despite having no prior pain or any red flags on previous scans.
So if imaging isn't like the holy grail of back pain diagnosis, what is? Like I've always wondered why some people can just, bend and twist with ease, while others seem to like throw their back out just by sneezing.
Right. Well, they dive deep into this concept of the neutral zone of the spine. And basically, it's this range of motion where the load is distributed evenly across your discs and vertebrae. So it's kind of this sweet spot where you can move freely without putting too much stress on your back.
Okay, that makes sense. So are they saying that we should just like avoid any movement outside of this neutral zone? I mean, that sounds pretty limiting, especially for, us gym rats.
Not necessarily. It's more about understanding how the load that you're under plays a critical role. So think about it this way. Flexing your spine under minimal load, like in a cat-cow stretch, is totally fine. But when you start to add heavy weight to the equation, like if you're squatting with a rounded back, that's when things can get a little bit risky. Because that force and velocity on a flexed spine can really increase your risk of injury.
Okay, so that explains why I can like touch my toes without any issue. But if I try to round my back while deadlifting, I'm asking for trouble.
Exactly. And it also kind of highlights why certain athletes, like dancers or gymnasts, can move their spines through these extreme ranges of motion without any issues. While weightlifters and powerlifters really need to prioritize keeping a stiff neutral spine, especially under heavy loads.
Okay, so we've debunked the MRI myth and we've learned about this neutral zone. But what about actually fixing back pain? I've been told by some doctors to just rest and avoid lifting altogether, and it just felt like the cure was worse than the disease.
Right. Well, the book actually kind of pushes back against that common advice. While rest can be helpful in the short term, they really emphasize that building core stability is essential for long-term recovery and prevention.
So it's not about babying our backs, it's about making them stronger. I like that approach a lot better. But how do we actually go about doing that? What kind of exercises are we talking about here? I'm assuming endless crunches aren't the answer.
Well, actually, they kind of challenge the effectiveness of those traditional dynamic core exercises like crunches and sit-ups. And they actually suggest that isometric exercises where you're holding a static position rather than moving through a range of motion are far more effective in creating spinal stability.
Really? That's surprising. I've always thought of crunches as like the go-to for core strength.
Yeah, and it makes sense, because those traditional dynamic exercises can actually kind of reinforce those movement patterns that contribute to back pain in the first place.
Yeah.
So if you think about it, if you're already prone to rounding your back, doing a bunch of crunches, might actually make that worse. Isometric exercises, on the other hand, really teach your core muscles to stabilize your spine in a fixed position, which is much more functional for lifting in everyday life.
Okay, I'm starting to see the light here. So what are some examples of these isometric core exercises?
Well, that's where they introduce their big three. The big three, they're designed to build serious core stability without aggravating that back pain. We're talking the modified curl up, the bird dog, and the bridge.
Okay, I've definitely heard of those before, but I'm guessing the book's take on them is maybe a little bit more nuanced than, the standard gym class versions.
You got it. The focus here is on precise form and gradual progression to really target those deep stabilizing muscles.
Okay, so let's break these down. First up, the modified curl up. So what sets that apart from a regular curl up?
Well, it's all about maintaining that neutral spine. So instead of like crunching all the way up, the modified curl up is more of a subtle lift. So you're lying on your back with one knee bent, and you're going to put your hands under your lower back to help maintain that neutral position.
Yeah.
And then you're just going to lift your head and shoulders slightly, Like think an inch off the ground and hold it for 10 seconds.
Wow, it sounds almost too simple. But I guess that's the point, right? Quality over quantity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're not aiming for height or reps here. You're really just focusing on engaging those deep core muscles and keeping that spine stable throughout.
Okay. Yeah, I can see how that would be much safer for someone with, you know, back pain. Now, what about the bird dog? I've always loved that one, but I'll admit my balance isn't exactly top
Yeah,
notch.
don't worry. We've
Yeah.
all been there. The key with the bird dog, again, is that neutral spine. So you're going to start on all fours, like a tabletop position,
Wow.
and then you're going to simultaneously extend one arm forward and the opposite leg back, keeping both parallel to the floor. And the trick is to avoid any twisting or sagging in your lower back.
Okay. Yeah, I can see how that would really challenge your core to keep everything stable. It's like a full body balancing act.
It is, and the book has some great tips for kind of building up to that. You can start by just lifting one limb at a time and then progress to holding the position for longer durations.
Okay, cool. Got it. Now on to bridges. I've always felt bridges more in my hamstrings than in my core. Is that normal?
Yeah, that's a pretty common experience, but it shouldn't be happening. You want to make sure that you're driving through your heels and squeezing your glutes at the top of the movement, not just lifting your hips. If you find it still in your hamstrings, try performing the bridge with your hands pressing into a wall. That can help to activate your core a little bit more effectively and take some of the strain off of those hamstrings.
Okay, that's a great tip. So we've covered the big three, which are awesome for building that foundational stability. But what about getting back to like the heavier lifting? Can we incorporate those big compound movements into our routine while we're still rehabbing our backs?
Absolutely. In fact, rebuilding Milo is all about rebuilding strength and resilience through movement. They actually advocate for exercises that challenge your core in multiple planes of motion. So things like pushing, pulling, carrying, and anti-rotation exercises.
So we're talking about movements like, deadlifts and rows and carries, but aren't some of those considered kind of risky for people with back pain?
It really all comes down to proper technique and progression. So take the deadlift, for example. It's a fantastic exercise for building overall strength and teaching your core to resist flexion under heavy loads.
But didn't we talk earlier about how flexing your spine under heavy load is like a big no-no?
Right, and that's why mastering the form is so crucial. Because with a proper deadlift, your spine stays neutral throughout that entire movement. You're essentially training your core to stay strong and stable, even under significant weight.
So it's almost like a moving isometric exercise for your core.
Exactly. And those same principles apply to other compound movements like squats, presses, and rows. When done correctly, they can be incredibly beneficial for building a strong and resilient back.
Okay, I'm starting to feel a lot more confident about, incorporating those exercises. What about carries? I've heard those are great for core strength, but I haven't really experimented with them much.
Carries are fantastic. Think about something as simple as a suitcase carry. You know you're walking with a weight in one hand, and your core has to work overtime to keep you upright and prevent you from leaning to one side.
So it's basically like a walking plank.
Pretty much. It's a simple, yet incredibly effective way to strengthen your obliques and those deep core muscles. And you can progress it by increasing the weight to the distance or even changing the type of carry, like a farmer's carry, where you're holding weight in both hands.
I like that. It's a very functional exercise, too. We all carry things in our everyday life. What about anti-rotation exercises? Those sound pretty intense.
They can be. A classic example is the Palloff press. You're basically using resistance bands or cables to create rotational force that you have to resist. It's a great way to train your core to stay stable even when those external forces are trying to pull you off center.
Okay, I'm definitely adding that one to my list. Now let's talk about something that I know a lot of athletes have strong opinions about: Olympic lifts. Some people swear by them while others avoid them like the plague, especially when dealing with back pain. What's Rebuilding Milo's take on that?
The book acknowledges that Olympic lifts can be a valuable tool for building explosiveness and power, but they also carry a higher risk of injury if they're not performed correctly. So they recommend waiting until you've built a solid foundation of strength and stability before incorporating them.
So no rushing into snatches and clean and jerks before you're ready. What kind of benchmarks do they suggest for knowing you're ready?
They advise waiting until you can comfortably perform both a squat and a deadlift at 70% of your previous 1 rep max without any pain. That kind of demonstrates that you have that requisite strength and control to handle the demands of those Olympic lifts.
That makes sense. It's all about, building up gradually and not pushing yourself too far too fast. Speaking of tools that can help or hinder our back health, let's talk about weightlifting belts. To belt or not to belt that is the question.
Right. Rebuilding Milo has a really interesting perspective on belts. They acknowledge the benefits, like providing that extra support and increasing intra-abdominal pressure, which it can enhance stability during those heavy lifts. However, they also caution against becoming overly reliant on belts.
Yeah, I've definitely been guilty of that in the past. I used to think a belt was like a magical force field protecting my back. But, now I realize that might have been doing more harm than good.
Yeah, because overusing a belt can actually hinder the development of your natural core strength. It's kind of like wearing a cast for too long. Your muscles get used to not working, and they can actually weaken.
So it's about using belts strategically, not as a crutch.
Exactly. The book suggests even incorporating beltless training days just to make sure that you're continuing to challenge and strengthen your core naturally.
Okay, that's a great point. It's about finding that balance and listening to your body. Are there any other exercises that the book specifically advises being cautious with?
There are two that they highlight, good mornings and kettlebell swings. Both of those can put a lot of stress on the lower back if they're performed with improper form.
Okay, I can see how this could be a little tricky. I've always been a bit intimidated by good mornings, to be honest. They seem like they're just waiting to wreck your back.
The key with both exercises is to really prioritize hip-driven movement and core engagement. So for example, with kettlebell swings, the focus should be on hinging at your hips and driving the movement with your glutes, rather than using your arms or back to lift the weight. It's almost like you're trying to knock a golf ball behind you with your butt.
That's a great visual. I'm definitely going to keep that in mind next time I pick up a kettlebell. Now let's talk about something that I've heard conflicting information about over the years. Hamstring flexibility. Is it truly the key to a healthy back, or is that just another fitness myth?
Get ready for a myth-busting session. Rebuilding Milo actually takes a deep dive into this, and what they found might surprise you. They argue that tight hamstrings are often a symptom or adaptation to back pain, not the root cause.
Really? That's interesting because I've been told countless times that I need to stretch my hamstrings to relieve my back pain.
Yeah, it's a common belief. But the book challenges that with some pretty compelling evidence. They point out that, a lot of people with flexible hamstrings still experience back pain. And conversely, some with tight hamstrings have no issues at all.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've definitely known people who could practically do the splits and still complain about back pain. So if it's not all about hamstring flexibility, what is it about?
Well, they emphasize the importance of distinguishing between flexibility and mobility. So flexibility is your passive range of motion, while mobility is your ability to actively move through that range of motion. So you could have someone with tight hamstrings who actually has excellent hip mobility because they've trained their body to move efficiently.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all kind of ties together. It's not just about, how far you can stretch, but how you move and control your body.
Exactly. And that leads us to a more nuanced view of hamstring stretching. Instead of kind of those blanket recommendations, they suggest a more individualized approach.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice? Should we be stretching our hamstrings at all?
Well, they suggest that short duration stretches less than 30 seconds before training might be beneficial for some people, but holding those stretches for longer periods could actually decrease performance.
So it's about listening to your body and figuring out what works best for you.
Exactly. And they emphasize the importance of addressing any underlying movement restrictions or weaknesses before resorting to stretching. It's about treating the whole person, not just focusing on one isolated area.
It sounds like Rebuilding Milo is really advocating for a holistic approach to back health. It's not about, finding a quick fix, but about understanding the interconnectedness of our bodies and building resilience from the inside out.
Absolutely. And speaking of holistic approaches, the book touches on something that I think is often overlooked in the conversation about back pain.
And that is, the role of our nervous system.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's easy to think about back pain as purely a physical thing, but the book, Rebuilding Milo, it really emphasizes the role of our brains and how we experience pain.
Okay, so are they saying that back pain is all in our heads?
Well, not exactly
Yeah.
all in our heads,
Yeah.
but more like, our brains can kind of amplify or even create the sensation of pain even when there isn't any actual tissue damage. Like think about phantom limb pain. People who have lost a limb can still feel pain in that limb even though it's not there anymore.
Yeah, that's crazy. So what does this all mean for, us lifters who are dealing with back pain? How do we address that nervous system component?
Well, the book talks about the importance of graded exposure and movement. So it's about gradually reintroducing those movements that you might be kind of fearful of because of past pain experiences. The idea is to kind of retrain your brain to understand that these movements are safe. and they don't need to trigger that pain response.
So it's like desensitizing yourself to the fear of pain.
Exactly. It's about building that confidence and trust in your body again. And this really ties back to, everything we've been talking about, understanding the true nature of back pain, building that core stability, mastering proper movement patterns. When you have those foundations in place, you're much better equipped to approach movement with less fear and more confidence.
Man, this has been such an eye-opening conversation. I feel like I finally have like a framework for understanding back pain that goes beyond just treating the symptoms.
Yeah, and that's what's so empowering about rebuilding Milo. It gives you the knowledge and the tools to really take control of your back health, not just for now, but for the long term.
So let's recap some of the key takeaways for our listeners out there who might be battling back pain. First, we need to ditch the idea that an MRI is like the be-all, end-all of diagnosis.
Absolutely. Remember, a lot of people have structural abnormalities that show up on scans but never actually experience pain. It's about understanding how your body moves and responds to load, not just what a picture shows.
Right. Second, we need to build that rock-solid core stability. And forget about the endless crunches, isometric exercises are where it's at.
The big three, the modified curl-up, the bird dog, and the bridge, are fantastic starting points. And don't shy away from those big compound movements like squats, deadlifts, and presses. They're your allies in building a stronger, more resilient back. Just make sure you're prioritizing proper form and progression.
And let's not forget about carries and anti-rotation exercises. Those are sneaky good for core strength.
Yeah, and remember that nervous system plays a huge role in how we experience pain. Graded exposure and movement are key to retraining your brain to understand the movement is safe and doesn't have to equal pain.
This has honestly been a game changer for me. I feel like I finally have the knowledge and the tools to really tackle back pain head on and rebuild a stronger, more resilient body.
Yeah, and that's the ultimate goal, right?
Yeah.
To not let back pain hold us back from doing the things that we love. Remember, knowledge is power, and when it comes to our bodies, that power can be truly transformative.
So to all our listeners out there, keep learning, keep moving, and keep pushing yourselves toward your fitness goals. And if you're struggling with back pain, don't despair. Rebuilding Milo is an incredible resource that can help you get back on track. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and until next time, happy lifting.